The day started like any other for Alyssa Davis, a 28-year-old marketing executive, as she hurriedly finished her work before heading to the airport. She had planned this trip for weeks, a quick getaway to her hometown to reconnect with family after months of grueling deadlines and endless work. The silence that filled the sterile airport terminal felt heavy, the kind of quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. But Alyssa welcomed it. In the chaos of her daily life, she had grown used to the demands, the noise. This calm was a brief respite. When the flight was announced, Alyssa found herself among the last few passengers. The terminal was nearly empty, strange, considering it was the holiday season. The last-minute travelers, scattered across the waiting area, looked tired, frustrated. She noticed a few elderly people, families, and a handful of solo passengers like herself. No one seemed particularly excited, even as the boarding call echoed over the loudspeakers. Alyssa quickly made her way onto the plane, settling into her window seat, a small relief to be off her feet. The flight attendants greeted her with their usual polite smiles, though something felt off. Their eyes were distant, almost too perfect, like the motions they were going through were rehearsed. She tried to shake off the thought, reminding herself that the job of flight attendants was stressful, especially on a holiday. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Alyssa gazed out the window at the darkening sky, the city lights twinkling below. It was an overnight flight, and the sight of the city from above always gave her a sense of peace. She couldn't wait to be with her family again, even if it meant facing her mother's overwhelming expectations and questions about her life. But this trip would be different. She could feel it. She didn't know why, but something was stirring inside her, a strange anticipation that felt almost like a warning. The plane lifted into the night sky, and Alyssa leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. The rhythmic hum of the engine soothed her. It wasn't long before the passengers around her settled into their own routines, some pulling out books, others glancing at their phones or nodding off. But for Alyssa, the sense of unease didn't quite fade. The eerie quiet settled in, a sort of collective silence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. Normally, she would have heard the soft murmur of conversations around her, the gentle clinking of the service cart, the occasional cough or laughter. But tonight, all that was absent. It was as though the air had become thicker, heavier, stifling sound itself. Alyssa shook her head, trying to focus on the movie screen in front of her, but the silence gnawed at her. It was then that she noticed it. One by one, passengers began to fall silent, not a single word spoken among them. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but as time passed, the stillness deepened. Alyssa tried to catch the eye of the man sitting across the aisle, but he was staring straight ahead, unblinking. His lips were closed, not a single movement from him. She couldn't hear the soft rustling of the flight attendants as they passed, nor the gentle whir of the air conditioning. The cabin was completely soundless. She felt a chill creep down her spine, something primal that she couldn't quite explain. This wasn't normal. She wasn't sure if it was the strange atmosphere or the unease in her gut, but Alyssa's hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone. She needed something, anything to break the silence. But as her fingers brushed against the screen, no sound came. The volume buttons didn't work. It was as if she was trapped in a world where no one could speak, not even herself. Panic started to swell in her chest. This wasn't just an ordinary flight, was it? She glanced around again, noticing the same blank expressions on everyone else's faces. The flight attendants were moving like robots, serving drinks, but their eyes were glazed over, vacant. They didn't make eye contact with anyone. The tension was suffocating. Alyssa pulled her seatbelt tighter, trying to steady herself. She closed her eyes again, taking slow, deep breaths. It had to be some sort of trick, a prank maybe. She would laugh about it later, when the plane landed and the silence was finally explained. But deep down, She knew that wasn't likely. This felt real. Too real. The silence pressed in like a living thing, and she couldn't escape it. Minutes turned into hours, but the silence never broke. Alyssa tried everything she could think of to regain some control over the situation. Checking her phone again, tapping the screen repeatedly, shaking it as if that might wake her from this nightmare. Nothing. The eerie quiet persisted, hanging like a thick fog. A thought crossed her mind. Was this some sort of psychological experiment? Could it be? She had heard of social experiments conducted in controlled environments, but this? No, this felt far too real to be a hoax. The only thing that confirmed her suspicions was the sense of isolation she now felt. The passengers around her weren't even acknowledging her existence anymore, not even the flight attendants, who walked by without a glance. Alyssa turned to the window, seeking solace in the view. But even the stars outside seemed distant, indifferent. The usual hum of the engines, the noise of the air flowing through the cabin, the quiet whispers of passengers, all gone. In their place was a profound, suffocating stillness. She looked down at the empty cup in her hand. She hadn't heard the flight attendant approach, yet she had been served a drink. Her mind raced. How was this happening? Alyssa wanted to shout, to scream, to break the silence, but her voice felt like it was locked inside her chest. She tried to speak, but her mouth moved without sound. Her heart raced faster now, each beat pounding against her ribs. Her hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the armrests, desperately trying to hold onto something real. Her mind was a blur of questions, none of them making any sense. Why was this happening? Why couldn't she hear? Why couldn't she speak? Was anyone else aware of what was going on? She glanced across the aisle again. There was a man, probably in his late 40s, with a stern expression, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. But his mouth didn't move. He was as quiet as the rest. Alyssa stood up, her legs shaky, and made her way down the aisle, unsure of what she was even searching for. The flight attendants, who had passed her a moment ago, now seemed to glide down the aisle without acknowledging her. There was no sound from their footsteps. The cart they pushed rolled smoothly, but there was no clink of the wheels, no rattle of the metal. Something was deeply wrong. She reached the back of the plane, trying to speak to the flight attendant, but the woman simply stared ahead with an empty gaze. No words. Alyssa felt the weight of the silence crushing her chest, making it hard to breathe. She reached for the attendant's arm, but the woman's skin felt cold, unnaturally so. The lack of response from the woman sent a chill down her spine. Alyssa tried another tactic. She grabbed a flight magazine, flipping it open in front of the attendant, hoping for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But the attendant simply glanced at her and then walked past, not a single word escaping her lips. Something was happening to her, to everyone on this plane. The thought began to settle in her gut. The silence wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was a sign. But a sign of what? It was then that a memory surfaced, like a voice from the past. Alyssa remembered a conversation she'd had with her grandmother years ago. Her grandmother, always mysterious and full of stories, had mentioned something about her family being bound by an ancient pact, a pact with a powerful, unseen force. The price of silence was steep, and it was never meant to be broken. Alyssa had thought it was just an old woman's tale, a warning for children to behave, but now, in the eerie quiet of this flight, her grandmother's words rang in her ears. The silence was a curse. Her family's curse. The thought hit her like a slap. She had never believed in curses, not truly. But as she stood in the aisle, surrounded by silent passengers, Alyssa couldn't deny the truth any longer. This silence, this unbroken stillness, was not a coincidence. It was a manifestation of something far darker, a force tied to her bloodline. Alyssa's pulse quickened as she retraced her grandmother's words. You must never speak the name of what haunts us. The curse lives as long as you remain silent. Her grandmother had said that so many years ago, but Alyssa had never understood its meaning until now. The curse had been passed down through the generations. Every descendant of her family was meant to carry the silence, and if it was ever broken, there would be a price to pay. Alyssa was the last of her family's line. The weight of that realization crashed down on her like a wave. She began to feel the weight of the curse in a new way. It was as though her very presence on this plane had triggered something ancient. Alyssa realized that breaking the curse was the only way to return things to normal. But how could she? She had no power. She didn't even know where to start. She wasn't a witch, wasn't trained in any form of magic. She was just a young woman trying to make a life for herself, far from the stories of her ancestors. Yet the silence demanded something of her, something she could not ignore. It was as if the air around her thickened, heavy with the unspoken words she hadn't even known she was holding inside. Her hands trembled again, but she knew what she had to do. She had to speak the words her family had kept hidden for generations. Only then could the curse be lifted. Only then could the silence end. But as she stood there, alone in the aisle, the realization struck her. What would speaking the words cost her? Would it free her? Or would it trap her forever in a web of darkness? And then she heard it. A whisper, low and barely audible, but unmistakable. It wasn't a sound she heard with her ears. It was a voice inside her mind, telling her to speak. Alyssa took a deep breath. It was time to break the silence. Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest as the voice in her head grew louder, more insistent. The quiet of the plane seemed to amplify the sound, not through her ears, but deep within her mind. Her thoughts were spinning, racing against each other. Was this truly the curse her grandmother had warned her about? Could it really be broken simply by speaking, as the voice urged? Her hands shook as she wiped away the cold sweat on her palms. She had to speak. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt tight, constricted by an unseen force, as if the curse itself was stopping her from breaking its hold. The passengers around her remained completely still, silent, expressionless, and Alyssa knew she couldn't wait any longer. Time was running out. She stepped back, taking in the eerie emptiness of the plane. Every seat was filled with the still bodies of the passengers, but there was no life in them, not in their eyes, not in their faces. Even the flight attendants, who passed her like specters, appeared as though they were caught in some sort of trance. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as though they were all trapped in the same nightmare, bound by the same curse. The pressure inside Alyssa's chest grew unbearable, the weight of the silence crushing her from all sides. She wanted to scream, to yell out in frustration, but no sound came. The silence had consumed everything, including her ability to break free. But then, like a spark in the dark, the voice inside her mind whispered again, "Speak the name of what haunts you." The words were clear now. Alyssa didn't know what it meant, didn't understand the full depth of the curse her family had carried for generations, but she knew one thing for sure. She had no choice but to follow the voice's command. She had to speak. Alyssa took a deep breath, forcing the words out from deep within. "I break the silence." The words were shaky at first, like a fragile thread hanging by a single strand. But as she spoke them aloud, something shifted in the air. It wasn't the sound of her voice, not exactly. It was more like a ripple through the atmosphere, a tremor that shook the very fabric of reality. The plane seemed to shudder, a faint tremor running through the metal walls. It wasn't much, but Alyssa felt it deep in her bones. The silence, once so suffocating, began to crack, like a window being shattered by a single, forceful blow. She opened her mouth again, ready to speak more, but before she could, the voice in her mind silenced her. It was as if the curse had noticed her defiance. The air thickened once more, and the pressure inside her chest grew unbearable. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, though their expressions remained blank, emotionless. She wanted to scream again, to shout, but it was as if the curse had locked her in place, preventing her from continuing. For a moment, Alyssa stood frozen in the aisle, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her body was numb with fear, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Something dark. Something ancient. Then, as if answering her unspoken fear, the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't just inside her head. It echoed in the silence around her, a low, menacing growl that seemed to come from all directions. "You are not free." The word sent a cold wave of terror through her, and for a moment, she felt like she might lose her grip on reality entirely. She had broken the silence, but in doing so, had she opened a door to something even worse? The voice was right. She was far from free. This was only the beginning. Suddenly, she felt the plane begin to lurch, like something was pulling it downward. The passengers, who had been silent and still for so long, now seemed to stir, their bodies jerking in unison, as if controlled by an unseen hand. Alyssa stumbled forward, bracing herself against the seat in front of her. Her heart raced in panic. What have I done? But it was too late to turn back. The curse had been unleashed. The plane bucked and swayed in midair, as though caught in a violent storm, though the skies outside remained clear. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat, as the world around her began to distort. The passengers, once so still, now seemed to be moving in an unnatural, synchronized fashion. Their heads turned to face her, their vacant eyes unblinking, staring with an intensity that made Alyssa's skin crawl. She backed away, fear flooding her senses. What was happening to them? To her? Was the curse trying to claim them all? But the plane continued its strange descent, the air growing colder, heavier, as if some invisible force was pressing down on them. Alyssa felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, and she swayed, struggling to maintain her balance. It wasn't just the plane that felt out of control. The world itself was starting to unravel. Then, the voice came again, louder now, its tone sharper and more menacing than before. "You cannot escape." Alyssa's stomach churned as the voice echoed in her mind. It was everywhere, surrounding her, suffocating her thoughts. She tried to fight it, tried to push the voice away, but it only grew louder, more persistent. She could feel her sanity slipping away, the fear gnawing at her, eroding everything she once understood about the world. "The curse is within you." The words felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Alyssa tried to breathe, but the air was thick with an unseen force, and the plane was spinning, tilting in ways that defied reason. She couldn't tell which way was up or down anymore. Her vision blurred as panic overtook her. It was then that she realized what she had done. She had broken the silence, yes, but in doing so, she had triggered something far worse. The curse wasn't just about silence, it was about control, about the power that held her family, her bloodline, in its grasp. And now, it was turning that power on her. The curse had found her. It was devouring her. The voice echoed in her mind, louder now, as if it had taken full control. "You are mine." Alyssa screamed, her body convulsing, her mind reeling with the unbearable weight of the curse. She had no choice now. She had to fight. She had to break free. Suddenly, the plane lurched again, and Alyssa's feet left the ground. Her stomach dropped as she felt herself falling, as if the entire world had opened up beneath her. The world around her twisted and spun, the passengers now moving with unnatural speed, their faces contorted in silent screams. "No!" Alyssa thought, her mind screaming for release. She couldn't die here. She wouldn't let it take her. With every ounce of strength left in her, Alyssa forced her voice to speak again, louder, more defiant this time. "I will not be your prisoner," she shouted, her words ringing out in the silent cabin. The plane lurched one final time, and Alyssa felt her body hit something hard. Then, everything went dark. Alyssa's eyes fluttered open, her head pounding with a dull ache. She gasped for air, feeling the pressure lift from her chest, the oppressive weight that had suffocated her for so long finally receding. The plane was steady, the air clear and fresh, and the silence gone. She looked around, her breath catching in her throat. The passengers were no longer motionless. They moved freely, looking bewildered but alive. The flight attendants were chatting quietly, as though nothing had ever happened. It was as if the curse, the silence, had never been. Alyssa's mind was still racing, trying to make sense of it all. What had just happened? Had it all been real? Was the curse truly broken? She looked down at her hands, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The curse was gone, and she had broken free. But at what cost? Alyssa didn't know the answer, but she knew one thing for sure: she had found her voice. And it was a power she would never take for granted again. The plane finally descended, landing smoothly at the airport. Alyssa disembarked, feeling the weight of everything she had just experienced settle into her bones. She had faced the curse head-on, and somehow, she had come out victorious. As she stepped into the world outside, the sunlight on her face felt brighter, clearer, as if she had been reborn. The silence was over. Thank you for listening to No Sound, No Escape. We hope you enjoyed this thrilling journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Check out the videos appearing on the screen for more chilling tales. Keep watching and stay captivated.